The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
There are but two powers in the world, the sword and the mind. In the long run, the sword is always beaten by the mind. So said Napoleon Bonaparte. And it's a lesson that President Joe Biden and other world leaders would be wise to learn when dealing with the precarious Ukraine situation and Russian head honcho Vladimir Putin. NATO and Biden certainly have the swords in this particular scenario. But do they have the mind to avoid a conflict that would be costly in terms of finance, lives, and reputation? All eyes are on Putin, and in this, he can claim at least a domestic victory. But are our leaders wise enough to avoid this particular gambit and let thoughts triumph over the spectre of war? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll delve deep into the motivations of those involved in the Ukraine crisis. We tackle the spin and deceit of the White House's economic messaging campaign. Longtime host of this here Liberty Nation Radio, Tim Donner, joins us for a very special signature Say What segment. We'll be looking at the latest Supreme Court case that could overturn affirmative action. I'd like to take a brief moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Amarillo, Texas on KGNC 710 AM and 97.5 FM. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. Ukraine is in the Russian crosshairs, and many are seriously asking whether the United States and NATO's response to Kremlin aggression is doing more harm than good. Is the whole situation being exacerbated by the Biden administration's dream of recapturing international acclaim? Or is everyone just singing to Vladimir Putin's tune, whether they know it or not? Well, to help us shed some light on this conundrum, we're joined by former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller, Dave Patterson. Thanks for being back on the show, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
So, Dave, give me your analysis. Is Putin the piper, and is everyone else dancing to his tune?
Well, right now it appears that that's the case. I mean, he has everybody writing letters and writing documents to him, meeting his demands. And so, yes, I think that that's where things stand. I mean, so far, Putin is pulling the strings, and everyone else in NATO and Washington both are pretty much dancing to the string pulling.
Okay, yeah, you mentioned that he's writing that people are writing letters here. Now, it's noteworthy that this week both Antony Blinken and NATO sent different letters to the Russian government, and there was seemingly no cooperation between the two. What do you make of that?
Well, we certainly don't know exactly what coordination went on behind the scenes, but the optics are, as you say, everybody is doing pretty much their own thing here. And it is interesting that Europe, led by France's president, should feel compelled to write their own response to Moscow's demands. That's kind of unusual.
It does seem as though the NATO allies, they're almost symbolically keeping Joe Biden or the American military out of the loop, as it were.
Well, that's right. That's the way it appears. And of course, that's kind of dangerous because if something should happen, they're going to rely on the United States heavily in order to blunt any sort of a overt attack on Ukraine. And so it does, as I said, it seems kind of odd. Nonetheless, the United States has its intelligence gathering aircraft flying over Ukraine pretty much 24/7 now. You have communications, the Rivet Joint, as well as Global Hawks.
Okay, so what do you make of the negotiations that are going on at the moment? Specifically, what is Russia asking for, and what are NATO and Biden saying in response?
Oh, well, the biggest thing that Russia wants is guarantees in writing that the Ukraine will not be part of NATO. That is the key demand that they have. And then they expand that to, and no former Soviet Union countries become part of NATO. So it is, it's their standard Moscow paranoia, and it is in a feature of the Russian people, and has been for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I presume it's because they don't want a buildup of NATO forces right along the Russian border, because they'd be in the same situation that Putin is putting Ukraine in right now.
Well, that's right. And, the other thing that puts Putin in somewhat of a disadvantage is that unlike 2014, when the entire invasion and annexation of Crimea, as well as the takeover of the Donbas region in Ukraine, that happened in about 2 weeks. This has been going on for about a year now, and so you would probably suspect that the element of surprise here has been lost. And Putin also has the weather working against him. I suspect this is one time when, climate change is a good thing. And that we can expect it every year about this time when the ground thaws. And so moving armor will be quite difficult, moving it through the mud.
Yeah, it's often overlooked how imperative good weather is in historical battles. Napoleon found that out to his sad surprise many years ago. Now, let's talk about Joe Biden's response so far. Is he treading the right path on this, or has his involvement or his lack of involvement made the situation worse than it should be?
I think that President Biden has a credibility problem. Every time he talks about some serious issue, almost within microseconds, the White House comes in with an explanation, a clarification of what the president actually said. And it's not clear to me that President Biden really has a grasp on what is taking place in Ukraine and how serious it can become if he miscalculates or has a misjudgment about what President Putin's intentions are. And this is always a problem. And now, obviously, the most historically significant miscalculation caused World War I.
Yeah, now that's an important point, because this really could turn on a dime, as they say in the States. Now, is there a win available for anybody in this situation? Now, we've spoken before about how Putin has the world's attention, and for him, that is a type of win. Everybody, all eyes are on Vladimir Putin. This is great for him in the domestic audience. But how do all of the various actors involved, how do they pull back from this mess?
Actually, I mean, it may be counterintuitive for the Russians, but there is a win here. Vladimir Putin can say to the world, listen, of course we're concerned. Of course we are. And to that end, we are going to place a few troops on our border with Ukraine and build a base so they're there in perpetuity. But that's only in case someone should start to move into Russia. And so we're going to back off here. And we hope that the conversations that we've started over our concerns will continue. And that would be a win for him, because, of course, they would. He would suddenly become part of the gang, and the conversations would be interminable because you have the State Department involved.
Okay, Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much. To our listeners, please check out Dave's exclusive writing on libertynation.com. It's fantastic. It covers all the angles. Dave, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we're asking which way will the Supreme Court winds blow on the latest affirmative action case. But up next, after this short break, we have a very special Say What segment with longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner. We'll be right back.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
And now on Liberty Nation Radio, we're fortunate to be joined by longtime host of Liberty Nation Radio and Liberty Nation's senior political correspondent, Mr. Tim Donner, who's here to launch into our special Signature Say What segment. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And off we go with our first Say What of 2022. So we'll cover a fair amount of ground since the end of 21. And no doubt, front and center is the steep decline of the 46th president, now into his second year in the Oval Office and already on the precipice of irrelevance after all he's done to reverse the policies of Donald Trump. And the reaction of the American people, whose approval has reached as low as a pitiable 33% in recent polls. But beyond the disasters he's created in Afghanistan and at the border and the urban crime wave, which continues, more COVID deaths than under Trump, and one defeat after another in court for his heavy-handed COVID-related mandates, it's his behavior that has people the most concerned. First, there was a speech that may well mark a turning point in his presidency. In Georgia, pushing for the lost cause of federalizing elections, essentially assuring permanent rule by his Democratic Party, this president who made unity the central theme of both his campaign and his inaugural, ripped apart those who disagree in a speech so divisive and incendiary it would likely have made Donald Trump blush. And the next day, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said he could hardly believe what he heard.
Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace? Do you want to be on the side of John Lewis or Bull Connor? Do you want to be on the side of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis?
12 months ago, this president said disagreement must not lead to disunion. But yesterday he invoked the bloody disunion of the Civil War, to demonize Americans who disagree with him. He compared, listen to this, a bipartisan majority of senators to literal traitors. How profoundly unprecedented.
George Wallace and Bull Connor were infamous 20th century racists in the South, and Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Biden likely forgot, though, that all three of those men were, like him, members of the Democratic Party. Notice how Democrats run from their history while Republicans tend to embrace theirs. Meanwhile, Biden spent months trying and failing to reverse the 1 or 2 votes necessary for Democrats to open the floodgates and pass not just that voting rights monstrosity, but also a massive inflationary social welfare package granting massive new powers to the central state. The fly in the ointment has been Joe Manchin, the lone Democrat, along with Kristen Sinema, to hold the line against their party's recklessness. Manchin over and over has refused Biden's demand to overturn the long-standing filibuster that protects the minority party in the Senate. And one day in a hallway in the Capitol, the West Virginia senator put a final stop to it and explained why.
Anything he can say to change your mind on filibuster and procedure?
Filibuster is what we have, our rules. The filibuster is what makes the Senate hopefully work when it's supposed to work. We need some good rules changes, and we can do that together. But you change the rules with 2/3 of the people that are present. So it's Democrats and Republicans changing the rules to make the place work better. Getting rid of the filibuster does not make it work better.
And so that was that. Joe Manchin standing as a lone bulwark against a massive expansion of federal power. But what to make of Joe Biden's increasingly mean, incoherent, unhinged behavior and increasingly frequent fits of profanity, all of which widely respected Dr. Mark Siegel sees as entirely consistent with the classic symptoms of dementia.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident in changing behavior. What do you do over there?
Mr. President, can I ask you a quick question on Israel before you drive away?
No, you can't.
Do you think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a...
There have been erratic emotional outbursts. There have been lapses. There have been memory losses. There's also the issue of the surgical repairs of his brain aneurysms that he had in 1988. They opened the skull in 88, and there's a study that shows a 50% risk of long-term cognitive problems. Atrial fibrillation. He has an irregular heartbeat. Study out of Nature Cardiology in 2018 shows twice the risk of cognitive problems as a result. And one more thing, that wasn't a hot mic moment with Peter Doocy. He was talking into the mic 1 minute, and the next minute he's calling them SOB into the same mic. Why would he think the mic was off? It was on a second before. So all of this is eyebrow raising and needs investigation.
This, of course, is deeply disturbing enough, but it gets worse if that's possible. Because Joe Biden has to know that as a Democrat, when you hear NBC's Chuck Todd, one of his chief supporters as a typically Trump-deranged member of big corporate media, say this about you. You are, as we wrote recently on LibertyNation.com, teetering on the brink of relevance.
He's lost his political identity that got him both the nomination and the presidency, right? What got him the nomination? He seemed electable, he seemed experienced, and he wasn't as far left as Bernie Sanders, but he was seen as somebody who was pragmatic, who would do what's possible, not what's impossible. And a year in, he's been focused on a lot of the impossible. What our poll shows, and I think what the reality they're facing is the guy that was successful in 2020 is the guy they need to get back in front of voters again in 2022 if they want to rescue the political side of this presidency.
Problem for Biden is that he won't have a deadly pandemic to exploit anymore, like when he was a candidate mercilessly blaming Trump for every COVID death. And the country is also now wise to the clever schemes of the Democrats employed to shoehorn this obviously enfeebled career politician into the Oval Office. And Mark, as we send it back to you, here's the question for all of us out there to ponder. To what extent will the weakness and failure of Joe Biden lead Americans to take a fresh look at the strong man, Donald Trump, in 2024?
And thank you, Tim. Yeah, I suspect that's going to be the ultimate question that will be consuming political pundits and just regular votes out there for the next 2 years, especially when we realize that 4 years of global stability under Trump, when, let's be fair, the supposed strongmen leaders of these non-friendly nations, they wouldn't say boo to a goose. Tim, thanks ever so much for your entertaining and enlightening segment. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming down the line, we talk liberty with Scott Cosenza and discuss whether allowable racial discrimination in colleges has finally had its day. Up next, we talk economic spin from the White House. Don't touch that dial.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
It seems that once again, we, the public, are being asked to ignore reality in favor of pre-approved infographics, courtesy of the White House communications team, when it comes to the economic status of the United States. Well, to help us dig out the truth from the spin and figure out what's really happening behind the curtain, we're joined by economist and author Andrew Moran, who has a weekly column on LibertyNation.com called Swamponomics that specifically dives into the economic fallacy touted by those supposedly in the know. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So it seems to me, Andrew, that there's an economic and informational propaganda war taking place. The administration seizes on one factoid and disregards everything else in order to put a positive spin on this presidency. Now, this is an age-old trick, but am I right in thinking it's going into overdrive under this administration?
Yeah, it really is. You saw that at the recent press conference when he was talking about how to rein in prices, and he's talking about competition. He's completely devoid of any reality when it comes to economics. And you think that his people who surround him, who are economic professionals, they should know better. I think a great example of this is when it comes to meat prices. He points to one fact, which is the meat industry is consolidated. I think four companies control about 80% of the market, whether it's pork, whether it's chicken. And he says this is the problem of why prices are so high. But if you dive deeper into it, that's not really necessarily the case. There's so many factors driving up meat prices. But at the same time, I mean, if there was a conspiracy to price gouge consumers, Big Meat would have done this a long time ago, even before the pandemic. They would have dramatically raised the prices. Or what they could have done too is that they could have undercut their competitors too. If everything was completely under their control, they would have just undercut their competitors, gained a greater control of the market. But that's not the case. It's just all these different factors. You have the weather conditions, fertilizer prices are sky high, transportation costs, the global supply chain crisis, the labor shortage. So no, it's not. I think my recent article was talking about how reality bites, and I think that the reality is Biden, or I should say, the lack of reality is in the Biden world. But what's amazing is that Brian Deese, he's the director of the National Economic Council, and he was talking this last summer saying, inflation would be high if you don't count the things causing inflation. And he was also making the case that, price inflation is coming down. But he's looking at the same data that everyone else is looking at, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation data or the IRI supply index numbers. This guy's looking at everything we're looking at, but he has a completely different understanding of it. These guys are professionals. What they should know better.
Three blind men looking at an elephant. Now, I want to dig deep into a couple of the recent claims made by the White House, now, and obviously promoted by President Biden and Jen Psaki as press secretary. Now, the first one came out this week, and it reads, President Biden has grown the economy faster in decades and added 6.4 million jobs, more in 1 year than ever on record, end quote. So there are two bits of information here. One, that the economy has grown faster than in decades, and two, that Joe Biden has added 6.4 million jobs to the economy. As it stands, both of those things are technically true, but not really. What are the lies and the obfuscations here?
Yeah, well, so there's so many things to go into that. So the first thing is that when we talk about economic growth, of course, the economy is going to grow if you're opening doors again. I mean, that's been the case since President Trump reopened the economy last summer. So that's not necessarily surprising. What is surprising is that you're juicing the economy with all this trillions in new fiscal spending, all this trillions in monetary spending. If I can paraphrase Hillary Clinton, you could ask, why isn't the economy growing at 25% per quarter with all this money being put into the economy? And then on the labor front, yes, 6.4 million jobs were returned to the economy. It's not new job creation. It's not net new job growth. I wrote this recently in one of my Swamponomics columns. These are all economies coming back from before the pandemic. If you look at the real numbers from before the public health crisis, the economy is still short 3 to 6 million jobs, depending on which estimates you're looking at. So that's also fallacious. Also, another important point too is that I was looking at this recent study that came out from WalletHub. It's a personal financial website, and they monitor all these jobless claims and labor data. And they found that of the top 10 states with the quickest unemployment rebound, it's been 9 of them were red states, and then the bottom 10 for the slowest unemployment rebound, 8 of them were blue states. So it's not President Biden creating all these magical jobs with, he's this entrepreneur creating business left, right, and center. It's just that, a lot of these red states, they have better tax policies, they have less red tape, they're intervening less. I mean, when you look at the whole Biden agenda, it's hard to say, oh yeah, he's creating all these jobs unless it's from, the government and, he's subsidizing these industries, which costs, I remember during the Obama years, they had this green economy, and I found that, of all the jobs he created under the green economy, cost taxpayers $200,000 per job.
It's very easy to say that I've brought an extra $1 trillion into the economy when you've spent $2 billion. Very easy to do. I could do that. I could probably get you a better deal as well. Now, another recent White House message sought to portray the president and the vice president in a very, let's call it a caring and giving light. It reads, the Biden-Harris administration announced today that $100 million of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding would be used to help American families pay their outstanding heating and cooling costs. End quote. Now, I can see your face here, Andrew, and for those of you just listening on radio, it's a doozy. I can figure this one out myself. The administration destroys energy independence, causes massive price spikes, and then robs the taxpayer to gain a few, let's call them empathy points. Is that about right? What's your analysis?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely correct. Energy prices were coming down, before this pandemic. Trump facilitated an environment of more production, more exploration, and you saw that with the prices. Natural gas was so low, crude oil was crashing. So a lot of houses were saving tons of money with cheap energy, and what's interesting too is that the U.S. was creating all this oil and all this natural gas under themselves, not relying on foreign oil. I remember writing this article a couple of years ago. It was a study published in the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it found that I think before the years 2005 and 2010, natural gas prices cratered 42%. Of the households that relied on energy, the winter mortality rate fell 2%. Because of all this cheap energy, more people were consuming affordable energy and not going to the cold. Now we're having this these massive winter storms, these massive snowstorms. It's freezing. You have a northeaster coming up. So all these people are spending more money on energy because of the fiasco occurring in the Biden administration. I'm not one to always say politicians are the result of this or the cause of that, but Biden was probably a main factor to these higher energy prices, at least domestically, because he could have said to the nation, hey, oil and gas companies, drill, baby, drill. I was writing in a recent article of mine, again, I'm promoting myself, but, I was saying, would inflation be as bad under President Trump? Inflation would be elevated. There's no doubt about that. He spent and borrowed and, so much monetary expansion.
With the best of them, yeah.
Yeah. But he would have most likely encouraged oil and gas companies to drill, baby, drill. When he left office, before the pandemic, there was about more than 13 million barrels per day being created by U.S. oil and gas companies. Today, the number is around 11 million. These companies are not drilling or not producing as much because of this whole regulatory uncertainty and this green energy agenda by the Biden administration. So, domestically, oil and gas companies have the resources. Prices are should be an incentive right now for them, but they're not doing it because of Biden.
Absolutely. Now, final question for you, Andrew, for me. Is the American public buying the spin?
Not necessarily. If you look at all the numbers, let's say, for example, you're looking at the recent Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index, that eased in January. It didn't ease as expected, but it still eased from the previous month. If you look at the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index, that fell off dramatically. There was a bit of a bump in November, but in December it just plunged. If you look at the Federal Reserve Board of New York's Survey of Consumer Expectations, majority of people say inflation is going to remain elevated at 6% over the next year. They think inflation is still going to be above 3% in the next 3 to 5 years. If you look at another number in that report, they showed that at least a quarter of households think their personal financial situation is going to worsen. Half say nothing's going to change; it's not going to be better or worse. So all the numbers point to. Actually, one more thing too. CNBC, they published a recent survey with another polling company, and they found that entrepreneurial confidence the economy has also been waning quarter over quarter. So overall, all the various statistics that that I'm sure the administration is looking at shows that a lot of Americans are bearish on the economy. Is it as dire as they expect? I don't know. It's what they say, what they view. Sarah Cowgill, one of our correspondents, she told me that, politics is perception. So if people think the economy is on the downturn, of course, no matter what you put in front of them, they're going to say that, and then they're going to vote your keisters out of public office.
Well, as Joe Biden heading into 2022 might be channeling Journey and Don't Stop Believing. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me. After
this short break, we tackle affirmative action on the court docket. Has a 50-year pendulum come full swing? Don't go anywhere.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
A long-standing tradition of legalized discrimination may be at an end, or at least that's what Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas hopes. Welcome back to Liberty Nation special Talking Liberty segment, where we unwrap the biggest legal issues of the day with the host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Scott, affirmative action, it's up before the Supreme Court. I believe this is the first time in almost 30 years. Can you tell me the ramifications of and what it really means for students?
Well, the Supreme Court has announced that it will take the case to essentially answer the question of whether its last landmark ruling in 2003 was properly decided. The current petitioners, Students for Fair Admissions, have sued a number of schools in a number of states, and they've gotten two of their cases accepted and merged into one. And basically, we're going to find out if colleges and universities are allowed to discriminate on the basis of race going forward against whites and Asians.
So it's specifically, it's going against the idea that whites and Asians are deemed to have to provide a higher score than ones who are not for entry into college, or is it a diversity quota within the educational institutions?
Well, I think there's a combination of both going on. If some of the institutions seem to have a set number of seats that they want to allot for certain races, and for others, it's just a more nebulous thing. It's curious, by the way, when we talk about whites and Asians, when the Bakke decision, that's the first landmark decision in the body of federal law court decisions that allowed race-based discriminations after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which, you know, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, it's very clear you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. And then some higher education folks thought that, well, they could do it anyway because they had good intentions rather than evil ones. But Asians were
the road to hell is paved with what, Scott?
Asians were included in the allowed to be discriminated in favor of case in 73. So from 1973 to 2003, which is when that Grutter v. Bollinger case, to 2022 now, Asians are obviously on the outs. It's kind of interesting how these things change with fad and favor from...
It does seem to be a pendulum that has swung different ways over the last 50 years. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of this whole case is Justice Clarence Thomas's position. Could you give us broad strokes what he's saying, please?
Well, in the Bollinger case, he wrote a dissent that I think was massively powerful.
Just to be clear, the Bollinger case was the 2003 case.
The Grutter v. Bollinger case is the 2003 landmark decision where the court kind of revisited things then. And Clarence Thomas obviously is the only black man on the court. And he said...
And one of only two justices on the court that are still there now, I believe. Him and Justice Breyer.
Yes, Justice Breyer and Justice Thomas are the only two justices still on the court who heard that 2003 case. And Justice Thomas said in his 2003 dissent that these measures denigrate the country as a whole and blacks in particular.
Okay, and how has his position changed from 2003 to 2022, or has it not changed in the slightest?
Well, we'll see if and when he's still on the court when a decision comes down in this case. But nothing indicates that he has changed his position at all. And to say that it was a strongly held position, I think, is an understatement. It was a remarkable rebuke to all things sort of race-based consciousness when he discussed this, classification on race and how insidious and poisonous it is to Americans.
Yeah, I have a quote from an article you wrote on this, and Thomas, I'll read that out to you. It's obviously a quote that you included in the article to give some background to it. And he wrote, "The Constitution abhors classifications based on race, not only because those classifications can harm favored races or are based on illegitimate motives, but also because every time the government places citizens on racial registers and makes race relevant to the provision of burdens or benefits, it demeans us all." Now, I think that's some pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, that's why I think it's unlikely that Justice Thomas is going to or has changed his view. There have not been publications in the interim that suggest he's moved off that position. And of course, another one of the things that the preference does is it denigrates the quality of the degree from all of the racial minorities for whom they earned that slot. So, for instance, there are one of the big name in the case is Harvard, the case that's going up. There's a UNC as well as included. But if you think about it, there are certainly Black people in this country who earned a slot at Harvard Law School or Harvard Medical School by the sweat of their brow, by their GPAs and their advanced placement sort of testing, MCAT or LSAT scores. But those people are lumped into the same group who have not earned it, who are elevated solely on the basis of their race. And it denigrates the achievements of those who have actually achieved rather than simply been granted, for favorable skin color, a slot in those schools.
Now, Scott, I've learned through long association with yourself that you should never try and predict what the Supreme Court will eventually decide, especially if you want to avoid any kind of disappointment, regardless of what side of the political
let me just stop you right there
on.
where you're going with this question, because I will just add the other thing is that Justice Breyer, who is the other justice who was on the 2003 court, and he not only likely disagrees, but went out of his way to sign on to a majority concurrence opinion. So Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the majority opinion in 2003, which basically said, we're going to allow that was a case out of the University of Michigan. We're going to allow them to continue to discriminate on the basis of race. We hope in 25 years, or presume in 25 years, this won't be necessary. And Justice Ginsburg wrote a concurrence that said, hey, hold your horses, not so fast on that 25 years thing. Maybe not. And Justice Breyer signed on to that part of Justice Ginsburg's concurrence. So he agreed at the time in 2003 that 25 years may not be enough time to see an end to this. And we're not even at 25 yet. We're at 20 roughly. So anyway, I think those are two votes we can maybe predict with some degree of confidence that Thomas will vote against the affirmative action plan, and Breyer will vote that it's okay.
It's quite interesting that the race of those justices and which position they're taking, I think.
Yeah, right.
Now, there is obviously a difference in the makeup of the political weighting here. Now, is it fair to say that being anti-affirmative action is on the more conservative side of the spectrum? Is that fair to say?
Yes. Being against the discrimination of people based on their race is now a conservative and Republican position, generally speaking, and favoring counting everything on race and granting favor and of course penalty points is the opposite side of that. Based on race is the sort of lefty liberal position.
So it's certainly possible that this could be ruled in favor of getting rid of affirmative action with the conservative balance on the Supreme Court. But obviously we wouldn't want to make a guess.
For those just listening, Mark, I have my double fingers crossed that is in fact what happens. Yeah,
absolutely. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
And that's almost it for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. My sincere thanks go out to our guests, Dave Patterson, Andrew Moran, Scott Cosenza, and of course, Tim Donner for the always entertaining signature Say What segment. And of course, my thanks to you at home for tuning in. You are, as ever, appreciated. As a final thought, let's circle back to Napoleon Bonaparte. He also said, the reason most people fail instead of succeed is they trade what they want most for what they want at the moment. Now, it seems that this inability to defer gratification on the world stage is on the verge of pushing a course of action that regular folks, people who love freedom, just don't want to see happen. It's not you or I that ultimately decide whether our nations become embroiled in costly and devastating military affairs. It is those who have pledged to keep us safe. But are their promises just dust in the wind when it comes to wanting to promote a vision of personal strength rather than national strength? In essence, I guess I'm asking, will it be hubris and ego that turn a delicate situation into a deadly one? Our nations are already strong because we have our rights and we have our liberty. Political posturing from leaders on both sides of this fight can only weaken that, and only then if we let them. Stay strong, friends.